All right, gentlemen, we are back with the Moby Book Club after slightly unexpected summer break. And we had a slightly unexpected summer break because I had two busy weekends in a row. But that gave you plenty of time to learn all about the classification of the different types of sea monsters, specifically known as whales, using the system bequeathed to us by Ishmael via Herman Melville. So I really think that this chapter that we just read is a bit of a separation between the people who really enjoy Herman Melville's prose and the people who don't enjoy it. Because if you don't have something pulling you through that besides just his great prose, I think it would be quite painful to read. But I, for one, think it's hilarious that this entire chapter was just absolutely, really, really hilarious. And he's just, we're stopping all the action. We're talking about his classification of whales. And I think Melville's doing a few different things here. I think he's pretending to be Aristotle and like classifying the different kinds of whales the way that Aristotle would have, rather than the, I guess, proto Darwinian naturalists would have done so. Um, because the way he classifies them, his three different things is based. Somebody's got some really weird noises coming through. Is based on basically the relationship to human beings. What could we see easily? A whale is something with a flat tail and a spout. It's like that's how we can relate to it. It separates it from the different fishes. And how big are they? Is this something that's going to destroy your craft, or is this just something that's going to swim alongside of you? And then he, instead of using a scientific breakdown, he just uses the fisherman's breakdown. How do people deal with these things? The fishermen who deal with them in everyday life. That is not a scientific way of going about things, but it might actually be a more useful way of going about things. So that's what I think about old chapter 32.
Yeah. I think there's more going on there for sure, right? I think one of the things that's going on is, again, we get back to this um, pulling the narrator into the story from the perspective of the narrator rather than from the perspective of his biographical version of the story, right? So a few things become evident immediately. He is drawing this information from other people, right? He makes that explicit.
He specifically references the coffins from Nantucket
right
on the who are an authority on whales, because lots of whaling expeditions probably.
Right, or maybe none. But then that's the thing. Like, it's very clear that we get back to the, how reliable is this guy? And the other thing that he's doing, which I find utterly fascinating, is this immodest statement about his abilities, right? But he's being arrogant about the whole thing. He's like,
Yes,
the reason
very
why
much
you
so.
should pay attention to this is because it's not complete. Effectively, it's the argument.
Well,
And
God save me from ever doing anything complete, from ever completing
exactly
anything.
right. It's his false modesty through immodesty that it's this weird, funny flip, right? In a sense that he's actually pulling off, which I rather enjoyed that. I thought that was hysterically funny, and also he's sort of using that, because on the one hand he's saying this is a far better classification, right? And on the other hand, he knows it's incomplete and that's not great, right? But at the same time, you get the sense that his is superior for the lack, right? And just the way he's thinking about this, on the page, which is even more funny. He's writing this down on purpose, knowingly, You know, it's one thing if you say something immodest or whatever and it slips out, whatever. That happens. It's another thing if you put pen to paper and you're pointing at it while you're doing it. And then I think that's it's really delightful in a way that he did that. And yeah, I mean, I think it's very much this, um, and this comes out, in the next 2, chapters, right? Which is we're introducing hierarchy again in a different way in the whaling sense. And so this
Mhm.
is sort of like the lame introduction to hierarchy via, this classification of whales. Um, and and that's sort of the beginning of what is in the next 2 chapters, where he's more talking about more the pragmatic approach, and how it plays out at the same time. Because on the one hand, there's a this is the stated hierarchy, right? And you could apply that to the ship. Like this is the stated hierarchy of a ship, right? But this guy really doesn't fit with that, right? And this guy until recently was hungry, and like little things like that. That's like, oh, so he's establishing himself as an authority on something, even though admitting he's not an authority on it, and using that to sort of justify his analyses writ large. And that I think is what really highlights the unreliable narrator portion of the book, is that he's always doing this, making these seemingly outrageous claims, and then having to having to point out how they fit in the world, even when they clearly don't. Right? His claims sometimes just is like, "What are you talking about? You're seeing things other people don't see," and stuff like that. Right?
Yeah, it's quite something. I mean, in what it's very practical, like the wisdom in that, huh? That what he mentioned about, I think it's not without content. What he's speaking, of course, it's very blasé, and he's being very funny, but um, it's like, what about what he mentions there that, yeah, so what if we would ever do anything complete? This is not going to be complete, because if a man were to ever make anything complete, that would be a reason to doubt its, like it would condemn the whole endeavor. Like if a man were to do something and it were complete, you can be sure that it's not like reliable. So, and that's like basically telling you, which is telling you, well, totalitarianism doesn't work. Like you cannot bounce off something, create your garden walls, and say this and establishes the entire world, which is basically Ahab's character. Huh? Like we're
Ooh.
gonna do this, and we're gonna enforce the boundaries. And this is like, again, nature be damned. I have my own goals, right? And this is how we're gonna go about it. Um, but yeah, I mean the ranking stuff is just hilarious. Like when he's talking about the Greenland whale and how it's been deposed because all the ignorance reigneth before, yet they didn't know. They had their false Leviathanic illusions about who was the real monarch of the seas. It's just like, oh, I can't get enough of this stuff. It's just good.
I really love the classification there, as that he just goes and he's like, to be short, a whale is a spouting fish with a horizontal tail. There you have him. However contracted, that definition is the result of expanded meditation. And the funny thing is, like, as a longtime whale appreciator and actually someone who aspired for marine biology, he's actually like he's presented it in a really useful way. Like, and I think so much the like the folio, the octavo, and the duodecimo are really interesting and comical ways of doing this, because again, he's like, in his weird logic, he's not wrong. So the whales, so a folio and an octavo of these different types of books, and they have the same shape but they're different sizes, and so all the whales that exist within the folio and octavo whale categories are roughly the same shape. And then but they're just of different sizes, so it makes perfect sense. And here's a guy that has just absorbed enormous amount of information and probably not integrated or discerned it very well, and yet he is able to kind of like fit stuff into those rough categories really well. So I thought that was a lot of fun, and And then also just kind of interesting to see, like, historically, what information was available about certain whales was really cool. And just kind of seeing, that he lists out a handful of whales that haven't actually been categorized yet because they haven't been seen yet. But interestingly, the sulfur bottom whale is also the blue whale. So those are the same whale, but he explicitly says, there wasn't enough information. They hadn't actually like seen them well enough. But yeah, just and to kind of to exemplify that even more, like the razorback whale, where he goes and it's just like it's barely even a paragraph, and he just says, "Let him go. I know little more of him, nor does anybody else." Like he's not even trying at that point.
And I think Ishmael's quite aware of what he's doing. We got this right here at the beginning of the chapter. The classification of the constituents of a chaos, nothing less is here essayed. So what he is doing and what he understands that he's doing is he's going into the chaos, going into the depths, and trying to find order there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we got really big, we got medium size, we got small size of everything that spouts water out of its head and has a flat tail. And that's as much order as I'm able to give you. And if anybody says that they're going to get you more order than that, you need to doubt them, because what we're doing here is no ounce of zoology is so much involved as that which is entitled cetiology. So
Yeah, so
leaving it, let's say, not having gone all the way to the edge of the fields is actually the appropriate way of doing things, rather than trying to conquer the entirety of the depths.
So he uses two categories, I think, right? Like one is the people who are actually interfacing, and the other one is who basically are researching these creatures, right? And like I got the sense while reading it that he basically discounts all information but what he's seen, right? And basically saying everything else you can't rely upon. Like, we're just going to use the authority of my own eyes to reclassify the world. So that's bringing in like a third authority, right? So he's referencing these other things as existing, but yeah, like those are far away, and like I haven't even heard stories of them, and therefore, right? It's like really, really fascinating. And one of the things that I'm doing the audiobook during the reading, and so there's these 3 chapters that we did, and they have completely different framing, but I also have a different narrator every time. So it's really weird, because like the one time it's a woman, and it's like I'm in a completely different book.
Interesting.
And what's happening, right, is like he's in some sense there is a telos, right? Like he's still in the book, right? Like it's not that it's completely disjuncted, but like I see it as like a thick thread, and then he's taking detours from it, right? He's reaching out, and I was like, okay, like how is he doing it, right? So I was trying to get the perspective, like how are you reaching out? And it seems like it's in some sense it's random in the sense of like, oh yeah, I'm now inspired to like, what is the thing that I can grab and pull in so that I can make it relevant in what I'm writing now. So that was really interesting to observe.
Yeah, I wanted to note that for anybody who doubts Castle in his insistence that he is like the whale meister, behold his chair. He has the whale.
I see a whale. I see a whale.
There you go. The harpooner's
There's
giving
Ahab's
you a laugh
lost
right
whale.
now.
There we
There
go.
we go.
All right,
Move him
gotta get him.
closer.
Gotta get him.
And then this whale is Mark on Fridays.
That's the Mark whale. Excellent.
Now, I'd be really impressed if I could throw it from when I was sitting over there to go through Diego's, and then if we could pull it off, we'll coordinate next
a
time.
good harpooner could manage it. RJ, I don't know how.
Well, I'm glad we bring it up because I was out on the boat the other day, and I mean, anybody who's been around the water can tell you, or even the beach, that polarized lenses are important. And you can think about what it allows you to see through a polarized lens for a moment. But what you can see with those, especially, is be able to read the water. And that doesn't quite make sense to people who haven't really been on a boat. But what you need to be able to do is see the winds playing over the water. And it's basically looking at that liminal space. And what the harpooneers are doing or they're taking that information they know about the different whales, and they're always scanning their horizon for that value. And we're kind of departing from that for a bit. And I love this image at the beginning of the chapters we went through, where I forget who it is, but he grabs a shroud and he swings it down like he's almost like he's Tarzan, from his position, and they're going into the boat. So it's kind of a change of direction through holding on a shroud, which is not quite like a tension line. He's not changing anything about the boat. He's using something about the structure of the boat to bring himself from a high place to a low place to be able to interact with other people. And that brings us into, I think, our conversation now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I wanted to point out too, like, there's nothing illogical, irrational, or unreasonable about his way of dividing up whales. Nothing. There's nothing wrong about it at all. It's a perfectly valid way to do this. And I mean, his claim that it is superior to the people who are just sort of, studying whales from afar or from other people's observations is true. And that's where the problem comes in, right? And I think, Melville's doing this quite deliberately, right? Because you have to kind of understand the time frame, what's going on when this is being written, right? We're in the middle of the 1800s. We're right at this inflection point culturally that leads to events like the Great War, which is two. We say it's two wars. It's really one with a big break in between, right? And that mechanization, and the interesting thing that he doesn't leave it out entirely, but he leaves it out. Okay, so I said this before. I went down to the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and New Bedford was known as the city that lit the world. Mm-hmm. And so what he's not doing in his classification is he's not talking about the whale's value in terms of their monetary value or their commercial value or their value even to bring light, which would be a very, almost biblical way of talking about whaling in general. And yeah, I mean, there's different grades of oil and they're useful in different ways. And he sort of touches on that, but that's not the primary thrust of his classification, even though the primary thrust of him whaling is to make money to some extent. I mean, it's not his highest thing either, which is very interesting, but it's the second highest thing. He's like, yeah, maybe I'll make enough money back that I can replace my clothes, right? And so it's a consideration of his, right? But his real reason is to get away from his own troublesome self, actually, right? I'll cause trouble if I stay on dry land and don't get into a hobby quick. So, and here's a hobby that pays for itself. Like, wow, 3 years of distraction for free.
I had not considered what you mentioned there of the kind of historical cultural moment of it leading to the wars. And I think what RJ mentioned about the embodying as like a way of classifying information of being of higher richness if it was a body, Manuel touched upon this as well. So if someone was there, that person is more of an authority than the book smart people, right? Do you guys think there's some sort of, because this is like 50, 70 years after the Enlightenment and all of that French stuff, and it's like early time America, is that rationalism, is that a big thing in the 18-somethings? I
mean, I don't want to just nail it down to one thing.
Yeah.
But we were in an empire building mood as Western civilization in that time. So I think especially of the German idealists who had these very large, complicated systems which were supposed to basically, solve all of philosophy. And a lot of that had been done by, Immanuel Kant, and you thought, well, gosh, if he had actually solved philosophy, they would stop talking, right?
I think,
but no, it just kept on going.
Looks like you just can't with Kant sometimes, Mark.
You just can't with Kant.
Sorry for interrupting, but
And then
puns are encouraged.
in the United States especially, there was this idea of manifest destiny that absolutely we're going to occupy the entire North American continent. And like, who cares if the government made treaties with the native groups that are here already? We're just going to continually abandon those and keep on going, right? So it's just all of this empire building. You see it in the realm of science where, like, year after year, they're isolating a new element. They're building the periodic table of the elements, and the technology is all progressing rapidly. So, and all of that being very, but it's like, it's not perfect, right? Because also in the 1850s, this whole slavery thing wasn't going away, and like anybody who didn't see some sort of major conflict looming at that time was not paying attention properly, because it was the political discourse was just getting hotter and hotter as the years went on. So yeah, that's definitely in, I think, Herman Melville's mind. It was in the entire world that he was in. Everybody building these great big towers.
Yeah, well, and I want to push back a little bit. I mean, I know that narrative's prevalent, right? The U.S. was never empire building. We've never been an empire. It just never happened. We didn't need to, right? Right?
We just invaded the Philippines for fun.
We invaded the Philippines for protection. But,
okay.
Yeah. But I mean, you can compare it through any metric, and I've actually done the work. Other people.
Well, that's really a good question, though, Father. Like, what are the boundaries of the American territory or influence sphere at this point? Because, what we think of as, I guess, America is still pretty much Yankeedom at this point. I guess I'm trying to be marginally fair about it, but excuse me. Obviously, Nantucket is going to be a home to that. Sorry, I just minimized my screen because my mic fell down. But on top of that, the question is basically, how far south does that go? I mean, New Orleans is clearly America, but
Right.
is it really? Because there's the French and Creole thing. They're next to the Spanish. It's where is the American cultural sphere being influenced by this time? We already hit on it, which is the Enlightenment, but it's specifically the Scottish Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm. Right, which is important. Scottish rationalism, yeah, like it's actually important to differentiate, because you actually can't make it work any other way. If you include Voltaire in the Enlightenment, you're screwed, because Voltaire's, he's not anti-Enlightenment; he's just a clown, effectively. But there's a more important couple of dichotomies going on. America is not an empire. All that's happening now is that we're expanding on the territory we're already in. And this is why you can't think of it that way, because Europe is, because they're going to occupied lands that are far away, almost always by sea, right? And they're civilizing them. Okay. No one in the North American continent is civilizing anybody. That is not happening. So there's two very different operations going on. And actually, it's fundamentally important to me. I mean, I did a video on navigating patterns with Adam about this, right? This frontier of ideas. And there's a huge difference between what's happening in Europe and what's happening in the US. You can cast them the same. You can say they're empire building and we're breaking all these treaties, which is also very questionable, by the way, and look at it that way. But the way Europe is empire building is what we would normally call empire. And the way the US is empire building is a simple expansion into lands that are sparsely occupied or completely unoccupied, in many cases unoccupiable, right? The entire Midwest is, you can't live in the Midwest. I don't know how people live in the Midwest. It can't be done, right? And so there was,
you need railroads and railroad depots to bring you supplies.
We're not even quite there yet. On top of that, and I have to bring up what the Six Gun did, because this is about the same time as, if anyone's familiar with a book called Empire of the Summer Moon, where basically between 1840 and 1880, you have I think it's the Apache, right, Mark? Is it the Apache? I believe it's a couple of people out there. I don't want to misname
four
people.
Big tribes. So,
four big tribes. There's a confederacy. But what I'm getting at is basically once you get past Kentucky, there's a horse-powered empire that only is able to be defeated through some of the same technology that is affecting Melville here in the book. And part of what's going on
Right.
with the cetology thing and into where they're looking at like the roles on the boat is like this boat is in part away from all of that. This is the chaos of the world where there's empires forming, proto empires fighting. Technology is really the name of the game. And then what is Melville focusing on here? The thing that catches my attention is the spec sender. He's the one who
Yeah.
cuts into the fat, and he's really starting to get to the core of stuff. And that's what caught my attention is the guy who swings down at the end, at the beginning of the chapter, more or less. And then we get into getting to the heart of stuff.
And it's important too to recognize Europe. I mean, this view that everyone's doing empire is the problem. Everyone's not doing empire. There's two different things going on. The question, and it is a good question, is like, why is Europe doing what it's doing, right? Like, what's driving all this? And it's RJ points it out rightly. Like, there's like, I don't know, probably 4 or 5, maybe 6 or 8 major technological changes happening all at once. Almost all of them here in the US. That's driving everything else.
Mhm.
And there are technological changes that have just occurred, like the guillotine. The guillotine is a huge technological change. It's unbelievable social impact that has no direct correlation to the French Revolution other than causing it, right? And then you have all this misunderstanding because the Europeans see what the Americans are doing as the same project that they're embarked on, of subjugating native populations and all this stuff that they've been doing all along, but now they can use technology to kind of go that next level. And so whereas before, and I think you see this with the older colonies that Europe has, they would integrate, right? They would fix land that was otherwise, not useful to the native population, and then they would integrate with the native population. This was always the French project, by the way. The French were always integrators. But that's not true for the English and the Dutch and everybody else, basically.
But the Spaniards, I think, would do more of that too, wouldn't they?
The Spaniards did more of it.
Than
yeah,
the English, certainly.
Right. And to Mark's point, without certain levels of technology, the American Midwest is a desert wasteland.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
what happens and what leads to the Empire of the Summer Moon is the French and Spanish abandoning their haciendas. The horses go free, which is where the horses, people like to talk about Assateague and Chincoteague Island a lot. This is where horses got onto the island, and everybody thinks that's where it comes from. No. Basically, there was a failed attempt to have plantations out in these areas, despite water being there for sometimes. Hi to the folks out in Colorado and everywhere else right now dealing with this problem. And when they can't handle it, the horses go free. People pick up those resources. And it's not really an empire. I mean, it's really just kind of a way of life that pops up for a time. But looking at all of that, the way that oil is still powering all of this, because it's when we get to a more effective type of oil, from the whale to what we think of today in typical energy today, the availability of energy really ramps up what technology can do. It's not just how you do something, it's how effective, how efficient, and how much power and how fast you can get it done. And that's what the whales allow people to do for the time. And that will change rapidly once, I suppose, Ishmael really gets back to land and gets about 30 years older.
Yeah, and it's important too to see this as expanding frontiers. And so Moby Dick is a claims to be a first-person perspective, and we actually know that it is because he did this, right? But it claims to be a first-person perspective on the expanding frontier of the ocean. Like, that's what it is. So there's 2 expanding frontiers in the United States, and again, I think I've been thinking about the world wrong, as usual, right? And the first industrial revolution in the United States is the whaling. And the second industrial revolution is the textile mills and that technology that we very deliberately stole from England, right? And improved upon vastly. See, that's the other thing. I mean, the United States is a lot like Rome because we adopt technologies and almost immediately improve them when we're not busy, creating them. And so, like, even steel, right? So steel is the same. It's the same story with steel, right? Steel's known about. Everybody knows about steel. It just can't be mass produced, and it can't be made in large pieces. Where do we get the ability to do that? Where does Carnegie get the ability to do that? From the UK. Not, he doesn't develop it here, right? On the other hand, what is developed here? Gasoline. That's Rockefeller, right? And the grading of oil, which means fewer explosions, right? You have a trade-off between whale oil grades. They're all low-grade oils, right? But they're whatever. There's only a handful. There's like 4 whale oil grades.
They're not terribly volatile.
When you get it out of the ground, the variance goes up, the volatility goes up. And then what happens is people are pulling things like kerosene and all this other nonsense. And then it's like, we don't know what grade it is. And Rockefeller comes in and standardizes it. That's why it's called Standard Oil, right? And then all the explosions and fires that were like destroying cities and taking lives left, right, and center go away. Right. And Rockefeller saves the whales at the same time. But yeah, different problem. So we're talking about.
I'd like to see a statue of Rockefeller in a Greenpeace museum at some point.
We should. Everybody demonizes the guy. I'm going to do a video on that someday, Diego. You can watch it on Navigator.
Mark, there's one thing that we've kind of missed, which is that aside from oil making stuff explode and set on fire, it's also what keeps things from breaking. The other petrols, the lower grade stuff, is what gets turned often into the greases that you buy at things like Home Depot or the auto shop.
Right.
So everybody who has ever been to Home Depot or the auto shop needing some kind of lubricant, well, you're also using this kind of technology, and that makes the whalers basically the people who stand in between things working and the economy's functioning and everything falling apart. And so the delineation of what goes on the boat sits again on that liminal space on the horizon line, going and hunting for this value as opposed to pulling it out of the ground. So, symbolically, these are very different behaviors. And that's, again, what catches my eye about the spec center.
Yeah. And I think, too, I just want to add a little more flavor. So let's go back to the bigger picture of Europe versus America. Europe is seeing America doing what Europe's doing, and that isn't happening. And this is why I have a video on the French Revolution with Adam on navigating patterns. You watch that too, right? Like, that's very much the French Revolution, right? They just misunderstand how the American, quote, revolution, which is really just a rebellion, happened and why. And they misunderstand the Enlightenment entirely. Whereas the folks here, fortunately, did not, and they understood a whole bunch of things. The same thing's happening, right? Because again, who starts whaling? Whaling isn't invented by us. It's just improved by us, right? But in a big way, like in a majorly big way. And Europe has spent years, because they're still whaling and we are not, trying to catch up, in essence, which is impossible. Like you can't do it. And so this is why I think actually this chapter is really important, even though it's a crazy chapter. And what is this guy talking about, right? He's actually very cleverly highlighting this science thing is, no good. It's no good because it doesn't match your phenomenological experience. I've been on a whaling boat. I've talked to people on whaling boats. This is the phenomenological experience of a whale. Oh, this is why the types are important. Oh, right. This is
really, it comes down to like, well, is a whale a fish or not?
Exactly.
Right? And it's like, does it matter to you that a whale has warm blood?
Exactly.
Not really, because it's still just something swimming in the water, and that's how you have to relate to it. Or the fact that it has mammaries and it feeds its young milk, right? It's like, yeah, but like we didn't get to see that until National Geographic figured out how to film that underwater, because before that, it's just mysterious. It's just something that happens out in the water. So the way that you interact with it is you pull it out of the water so you could do something with it. And we do the same thing with fish.
Yeah, it's interesting with the narwhal, right? Because that's where it does get pragmatic somewhat, right? Like, okay, like there's actually a functionality to this thing, but we can't discern it. So
we don't know what it is. Yeah. Well, you'll also notice that he makes he makes 2 appeals right? One is to the narwhal and the unicorn thing, which he spends a ridiculous amount of time on in some sense, right? But that's pointing out the mystery. And the other is he does use the term Leviathan. And he deliberately says whales are fish because it's in the Bible.
Yes, yes. He made an argument from tradition, which, as Boethius says, is the weakest form of argument.
I'm gonna bring up the famous in certain circles, the fact that Plato famously defined a human being as a featherless biped, and then Diogenes of Sinope walks in with a plucked chicken and goes, "I present to you a human." So that goes to show there are limitations with propositional definitions, and this is something that we've been dealing with as far back as Plato and Diogenes. And I don't suggest people go around using Diogenes' way of life. There's just not enough barrels anymore or marketplaces. So just a couple of deep cuts for you guys.
And
True,
and some what is it? Public indecency laws.
Yeah, and I think that's important. I mean, this is part of the reason why he keeps saying it's not complete, it's not complete, it's not complete, and that's what makes it right. Right, because again, he's, if you want to go all Peugeot on this, and I guess I do, right, there's always the margin. There's always the margin, right? You can make these classifications. There's always the margin. There's always that exception. There's always the thing that doesn't fit. And that's how you know it's right.
Okay, so Mark, you said Peugeot, and we are on your channel, and there's something about
No, not on my channel.
or
You're
not
on my channel.
Oh, geez,
You'll
I'm so
respect
sorry.
me.
I will. I'm so sorry, Father Eric. May I please bring up something about how Peugeot says that the axial point is like a wheel.
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's actually, interestingly enough, that cut will come up next week. But there's something about the downward triangle as a symbol that we see again in the mast that is an axial point around which the world turns, and yet this mast is on the water, which means basically wherever you are here, kind of like finding the center point on a globe. So again, the boat really is both it's both the temple and the tabernacle as it's moving and hunting for, and this is interestingly enough, the white whale can also be seen almost as tantamount to the Shekinah. He's looking for purpose, but he's also looking to grab the thing and bring it into the boat almost by force.
Yeah. So the great thing about a whaling vessel and telling a story about that is that you actually just get a microcosm of the entire civilization.
Yeah, and right, and well, that's a good way to segue in, right? Because that's what that was my main point about the culture and the cultural changes, and why this chapter, although it doesn't seem to fit, and it seems like a silly thing to do this cetology on whales, he's actually stepping back and giving you a very broad worldview picture of the problems of the day. And if you didn't see it, fair, man. Like totally fair.
Right. It's in the way he names it a little bit, like the octavo whale.
Right.
During this time you have the sciencey folks, but you also have the theosophes and the syncretists.
Yeah, the battle is right there,
and that's really who are pretty much fighting. And you have things like Rosicrucianism, which is kind of petering out a little bit, and of course there's a bunch of other groups, but you've got these kind of two worldviews very much clashing. And so he's teasing them a little bit. He's like, oh, okay, you want to have a category for everything. Well, is a whale a fish or not? You want to have numbered and meaningful and hyperlinked everything. Well, what does it really matter when you come down to trying to do stuff? And I love again how he really starts to move to the heart of the matter, and then I'm front running again. It becomes around the dinner table.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was saying about the segue. Yeah, and then you see this in the next chapter, basically.
Well, let's go take a look at that next chapter.
But I make just a couple of quick little things here. There's just one funny little thing that shows up. He describes the blackfish, and which we would call it a pilot whale now. he describes it as having an upturned lip and a Mephistophelian grin that's always on its face. And I just have a couple of pictures of it, and you can just kind of see it. This one really does it for sure.
Yeah.
I can't think of Mephistopheles anymore without thinking.
Am I the only one who thinks that whales are adorable?
They really are.
He's got plushies behind his chair.
Well, they're technically
There's a whole
hats.
market of people who think whales are adorable.
They're technically
that is
hats,
true
Father
fact.
Eric, but
I can't tell from this distance.
And,
Phenomenologically, they're indistinguishable.
I agree. And then also the mealy-mouthed porpoise. I just wanted to show that's a pretty great one.
Oh,
He's also teasing how people would describe things at this point in time, where like everything is kind of like an adjective formed of something else. You know,
Yeah.
he's teasing the current literature trends where it's like it's not flowery language. It's like she had thin and supple, graceful, willow-like, tree-like features, and it's like you're describing everything and nothing. You're saying so much and saying so little, and that's part of what Melville, I think, is teasing at by describing whales like this. It's like, no, a whale is not Mephistophelian-like. He's a whale.
I don't know. That was a pretty Mephistophelian grin there.
Grin. Mephistophelian, yes.
Oh boy. I guess the last thing I'd say about that chapter is I love his description of the pale-bottomed whale. What was it? You mentioned it earlier, Adam. What became the blue whale?
The sulfur bottom.
Sulfur bottom, and it's Tartar explorations. Like it would just be. It's like it went all the way down to the depths, and its stomach got burned by the lava down there, or something like that.
Well, it has. I think if I'm thinking of the right one, it's got like these kind of long, like almost like stripes on its bottom, as if it's kind of like. People need. I guess you can look it up, but yeah, it's a very interesting image.
Deep, yeah. They're also technically larger than the sperm whale by 10 to 20 feet. But
because
knowledge of that yet.
Because Herman Melville hadn't seen it, or Ishmael hadn't seen it, it's like he's not going to report on that.
You only see their tail way off in the distance.
Yeah. Alrighty, so chapter 33 is a really interesting little bit here. We've got this a little history lesson about the old Dutch refineries.
Are you going to butcher it, or like? Because I'm going to correct you.
What is it? What is it?
No. I want to see you do it first.
In American English,
American
English, and I'll remind you that you guys are surrounded by Americans. That would be pronounced Specksnyder.
That's very good.
That was better than.
That's pretty good.
Well, hey, we borrowed capitalism from you guys, so you know.
and the revolution and the Constitution, actually.
Really?
Great American nations. It's all.
We don't talk about Bruno. Let the Dutch be the Dutch.
No. We'll out them. Father, I think it's worth reading that whole first quote paragraph sentence because it's one sentence paragraph. I love this. I love
Concerning the officers of the whalecraft, this seems as good a place as any to set down a little domestic peculiarity on shipboard, arising from the existence of the harpooneer class of officers. A class known, of course, in any other marine other than the whale fleet.
So he's calling out class specifically and peculiarity, right? And it's not a peculiarity, of course, but it may be a peculiarity at sea for him or something. But
for a merchant on his first whaling voyage, it does seem peculiar because he's used to a really straightforward hierarchy. If you've got the captain, first, second, third. And then everything else goes straight down from there. But he points out that in the old Dutch way of doing things, you would actually have the navigation of the vessel would be the responsibility of the captain, and the Specksnyder would be responsible for all of the actual whaling business. So there was like this, I don't know, like this two powers thing going on there, maybe one being higher and one being lower.
I was going to reference back to the Language of Creation Book Club because in the Language of Creation Book Club, you have the one thing which is receiving the thing from above, and then what's being offered back up. It's the meat. It's the refined thing. So what is the specksnijder? The specksnijder is a person who's taking the fruits, right, of the voyage and refining it so that it can be presented in glory, right?
Mhm.
So there's an aspect where the captain is actually taking the instructions of heaven literally, like
Mhm.
not even like he's navigating, he's getting the ship at the right place at the right time, and then the specksnider is using what is attained by the captain to come back in glory. Like I can just imagine how it would be when the ship turns back after 3 years of voyage, right? Like it's like that would be like the same as an army coming back after a campaign of 3 years.
Mhm. Mhm.
So there's this correct relationship to the universe by the Dutch that gets butchered by the Americans.
Mhm. And this is something you see in church life if you pay attention enough. Castle, do you know what a protonotary apostolic is?
I do not.
Okay, neither does anybody else. It was something that was really useful in the Middle Ages, right? Because we needed to have lots of layers of hierarchy in the church. And it just got kind of unnecessary after a certain point. But you can still find a few of them running around. They can wear miters, but they're not bishops.
Hmm.
It was a
Uh,
useful category at some point, but it just kind of sometimes these things get flattened out over time because the thing that made them necessary is no longer there. But it could also be flattened out due to tyranny. And you gotta,
Also, like I saw an amazing bishop mantle, and apparently in the 1400s they were standardized, which I think is a shame because like I think there's something there in having an awesome decorated mantle.
mm,
Because he was like a walking painting in some sense, right, or a walking tapestry. That's a better word
mhm,
there.
mhm.
So I want to point to the translation because I'm also kind of disagreeing, right? It's not fat cutter, it's bacon cutter. Like
Ha!
right, and that will appeal to the Americans as well.
Whales don't have bacon.
Yeah, but the whales bring home the bacon, Mark.
that would come later, but yes, so we would say that that's anachronistic. But yes,
So, Manuel, does that suggest that there's a connection between, like, basically bringing butchers on board for when the
Yes.
whales are ready?
Well,
And then
like
maybe that role starts to collapse with the people who are capturing the whales anyway?
yeah, like I would say, right, like if it's sad, right, like the whales they ended up on the beach, right? So like who are you going to call when the whale ends up on the beach? You call the
the
butcher.
butcher. Yeah, yeah.
And
I
then
think
it's
I
like, oh,
think
let's go onto the sea because they're there and we can get them there. And then you take the butcher. Like,
yeah, but more specifically, RJ, I think you're missing the larger picture, right? This is the era or error might be a better way to say it, where specialization as like as its own category, right, expands to enable something called progress. We can argue about whether or not we progressed since the mid 1800s because I'll fight you. I'm not saying I'll win, but like I can make a pretty good case. Um, and that's that's what happens is when you have that problem. And this is technically where unions come from, right? You get all these specialties that have slightly different, interactions. And one of the first places that I can think of where this becomes a thing is this factory ship idea. And so if you go to the New Bedford Whaling, or when you go to the New Bedford Whaling Museum, because you all must go, this is right at the cusp of when they add a manufacturing process to the boats. So they keep adding specialties to the boats so that they can refine and come back with more stuff. And that's how you get fish sticks.
Mhm.
Fish sticks are not manufactured on land. Fish sticks are manufactured entirely on the boat, right, including the sealing and the ice and the freezing and the whole 9 yards.
And just putting the packaging in the boxes.
I mean, I think
Is the
nowadays they
marketing
bag them
department
on the
also
boats.
floating on the ocean?
Yeah, not all of them, but like that's especially in Europe. That's how that happens.
Do the
Yeah, that
CEOs
food
and
comes.
the corporate governors are they also on the boat?
So so I wanted to get some zeitgeist stuff going because I looked up the wars in the 1800s, right? And like I don't think there were any major or not a lot at least European wars except with Germany, Russia, and Italy. And there's a lot of wars with the colonies, like a lot of wars. And so you can see that the orientation, right, of these countries is no longer to what's around them, but overseas,
Right.
right?
Are
And
we past the Crimean issue, or are we leading up to the Crimean issue at this point, kind of generally? Because there's the whole thing with the Great Game, where they're trying to get access to the Black Sea, just to underscore your point about what's going on in the 1800s. Is like it people are thinking about, oh, I need access to the Atlantic Ocean or to the Indian Ocean or to the Pacific Ocean, and then you've got it really doesn't matter. Like
Because that's the
the
frontier.
oceans are the highways, they are the frontier. If you don't have access to water that has enough to go sailing, you cannot do very much, and your neighbors will probably start to aggress you.
Deep water. You need deep water ports. There's two types of ports. Deep water ports become important because that is the frontier. It's also how it becomes a de facto way to extract resources and supply your colonies.
Right.
Is deep water.
And Manuel brought up, Italy and France and England and Russia. That's what I added, fighting. But where are they fighting? They're fighting in the Dardanelles.
Right.
They're
Right.
fighting in near Panama. They're fighting in their colonies, which are all at these basically choke points at trade. And that's what the Portuguese really add to the picture, is that they set up kind of the proto network and identified where you kind of need to have gassing stations. And truly, like gassing, you need to have a
Yeah.
certain amount of oil there to run everything. And then once that's established, everyone starts trying to compete. And so even the whalers are involved in this, because it's not, they're following the food, but it's not as if it's just no one around.
Right. And
They've got to
in some
protect
ways,
themselves.
but in some ways, you have the disinflation of the hierarchy in Europe. You have the reinflation of hierarchy in the United States. And where the hierarchies sit has changed. So the hierarchies in Europe were noble hierarchies from the king down. The hierarchies in the United States are not. We deliberately built them not to be that, but our hierarchies become specialties. That's why I mentioned specialties earlier, right? The specialization turns into a hierarchy, right? And so the hierarchies reappear. So in Europe's flattening itself out, and that's what's causing the wars. They're also trying to follow a pattern, right? They're seeing what England did. England was remarkably good at extracting an absurd amount of resources very efficiently from their colonies. But this is due to a bunch of geographical things, a lot of luck, because North America is unlike all other colonies. First of all, just size alone, it's already bigger than what we call Europe. Right? The number of so-called untouched resources, right? The bounty and abundance, all the new things, all of which
navigable rivers.
Yeah, navigable, but like there's just 300-year-old forests everywhere.
People hear it called the New World, and they're like, "Oh, it's because they didn't know." And I mean, it really is. It's pretty self-contained.
It's as big as everything.
Yeah.
No, it's actually as big as everything you knew about before. It is Europe, only bigger. And so if you knew all of Europe, which no one did, but you knew of all of Europe, this is a new world. If Europe is your world and you look at North America, that is a new world. It is of the same size, scope, and scale. And so Europe, the other European countries are trying to copy. So the East India Company, the largest company that's ever existed, is far larger than any 5 corporations today combined, right? Everyone's trying to follow that model. That's what they're doing. They're trying to follow that pattern. And then they can't for various good reasons, right? The biggest of which is, well, North America declared its independence in some sense. and no one could do anything about it because we had the resources, and Europe's resources were waning. Right, we have new resources, they have old resources. Their hierarchy's collapsing, our hierarchy's being built at the same time, right? And that's this time period. And then there's this misunderstanding about let's call it the utility of science and of materialism as such, like what you can do with material, because precision artillery is a big deal, right? And this idea of efficiency by having all the specialties out on a boat, right? And use harnessing rivers to make cloth, so that one person can now make several hundreds of garments in a day, right? Oh, you couldn't do that before. And you still can't do it in Europe at this point.
So that brings me to two things and a question for Father Eric. We're kind of identifying that when you gather resources, it allows you to, I guess, begin to cut to the heart of things. And I'm wondering if Father Eric has any thoughts on that kind of cutting to the heart of where all the resources to kind of bring out the thing. In this case, it's the oil that allows all of this that we've brought out from the world and into this discussion to even be possible. There's a couple of things that strike me from the Old Testament, but I just wanted to pick your brain first, and it's really an open question. This thing about bringing out the essence of the oil and what that allows us to do. Just on that note for a second.
Has anybody else here ever butchered an animal?
I've not butchered an animal myself. I've seen it done.
It's not as easy as it looks, right?
No.
And what most importantly you need to do is you just need to get your hands in there and figure out where you're supposed to be cutting. And you kind of get a feel for, deer. I'm talking about deer, right? Not hunting the most dangerous game. Right. Deer is what I have experience with, and gutting fish. So,
gutting fish is it's interesting you bring them up because they're so different.
Yeah, but it's still that same kind of the way you get the meat out of the deer is, it's great that you have the winch and you can pull the deer up. It's great that you have a nice sharp knife. It's great that you have bags, a few bags for the refuse, the rest of the bags for the meat that you're going to keep. But you could put all those things together, and we could hand a knife to some, college student and say, okay, get it done. And they're just going to make a mess of it because they don't have the skill, the technique, the know-how of how to do this properly. I've only done it a few times. I still need adult supervision when I'm doing it. But you save a lot of money when you just bring a bag of meat to the butchers rather than having them clean the carcass themselves. So it's worth the effort if venison is your aim. So you may have been asking me because you wanted a biblical allusion. And I suppose in the Old Testament, the priests were also butchers. So
were they?
Yeah.
I guess, yeah. I just never really had a cause to think of it. I'm so the rules.
Not
rules
only the Old Testament,
right?
Everywhere.
No, it just completely flew over my head. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So it's basically the know-how. The Speckschneider needed to have a lot of know-how to be able to carve up the oil of the whales and get the good oil from them.
Talking about carving up, in 1885, Africa got caught up in order to extract all the resources, right? So that's also a thing that happened around that time. And I think like what was going on, right? Like, 'cause if we're talking about America being the promised land, like Africa also kind of was that, but also
but without navigable rivers.
Right. Without navigable rivers, with an existing civilization that wasn't collapsing due to disease, which is a really important factor. Everybody seems to forget when they're talking about North America. Like the civilization was already in decline and then got hit by disease. And so they were all done. Like, you could say whatever you want. Like, there would have been no one here, including white people. It wouldn't have been like, oh, the Indians would have been okay. No, that wasn't going to happen, right? So Africa doesn't have those qualities. It has existing cultures that are already well established, right? And on the rise, not on the wane. which is a huge difference, right? And then the boundaries of Africa get determined by outside forces, right? The maps get redrawn. That didn't happen in North America. It's quite the opposite.
I
right?
just want to point out that even the rum, sugar, and slave trade triangle really kind of worked at the hilt of a gun, and
Yep.
those guns needed greasing,
Right.
you know. So even that is dependent on what's going on here, which is an interesting thing.
Everything's dependent upon shipping, and in some ways the emergence of shipping, deep water shipping across ports is the thing that changes the world in a significant fashion. And whaling's, we'll say, the most technological piece, right? Because it's birthing the factory ship and all this other stuff. But it's not the only thing it's not the only change that's happening of that nature.
And Rome wasn't able to reach the zenith of its power until they were able to call the Mediterranean our ocean.
That's right. Yeah, you can't do. I mean, you can do a lot until you hit the physical borders of the land you're contained within, and Italy's got big mountains to the north. It makes it kind of hard, right? And then it's surrounded by ocean, right? And so once you fill that land up, which Rome did, then you have to go out into the sea, and then you butt up against Carthage, and then it's questionable as to what happens until you wipe out Carthage. So yeah,
and the pirates and piracy in the Mediterranean. There was a big campaign. I think it was in like the 2nd or 1st century BC against pirates in the Mediterranean, and that
there was a big campaign in what was it, the 1790s against pirates?
Yeah, by the U.S.
It was the very first thing we ever did as a country. We went and fought some pirates.
Yeah.
Off the Barbary coast.
And created a whole class within our society that is still revered above most other classes today, including all of the military classes. The Marines are the tippity top.
Right. So what would the spec sender be? Would he be first lieutenant?
Well, that's the interesting thing that that is pointed out in this chapter is that, like, in the Dutch system, the Specksnyder would have a fair amount of autonomy when it actually came to the whaling business, and the captain was the one who navigated the ship to and fro where it needed to go. And it seems like here that's been collapsed in the American system, where the captain's now in charge of everything, and the harpooneers are just other officers along with the traditional 1st, 2nd, 3rd mate. So they've just become another officer there. And
that happens due to a cultural change that is unique to the United States. And this is what, like, nobody talks about this. In what happens is, in the old days, the guys who own the ships would either be the captains or pick the captains. And there was a captain class, and that was a horizontal class, just like there's the noble class, which is a horizontal class, right?
Right. It happens to 3 captains, though, and you see the earlier show, folks.
Yeah, but what happens in this case is that so a captain was born into captainness. You know,
you'd have to everybody buy a commission. Yeah,
they were all born into their roles, right? Not exclusively, but like that. I mean, that's how the European system worked. The American system couldn't work that way, right? Because we were a newer population, and so you have the Boston Brahmin. Sure, I'm from New England. I know all about it, believe me, right? But by and large, you didn't have that. So in the captain had to rely on people with skill in the old days. Like, I don't know. I mean, I own the ship, or I'm running the ship. I'm in charge of the ship for whatever reason, however that comes to be. But I'm just here, there, whatever. Maybe I studied navigation, or maybe I have a navigator I'm working with, whatever. Right? But I don't know. That doesn't happen anymore. And this is mentioned earlier in the book. Like, these captains have experience. They worked their way up the hierarchy. Worked your way up the hierarchy? You can't even say that in Europe. It doesn't happen. It doesn't even happen now. That's the interesting thing, right? So Europe's very slow to adopt it, and maybe that's better. By the way, I'm not saying we got it dialed in. All I'm saying is that's why this happens. This happens for a reason, and he's contrasting the European system of, oh no, you rely on your experts, right? Because you don't have any experience. In the U.S. system, that's not true. People went into whaling on purpose. Generally, not all of them, but to buy their own freaking boat and to become a captain, and then to become a multi-boat admiral that didn't have to go to sea anymore, right? And so they'd put the hard work in up front, expecting the payoff in the back end in their lifetime, which was never an option before. I mean, this is one of the things people don't talk about. Technology enables this weird thing to happen that, again, I'm not necessarily a yes on it either, right? Like now all of a sudden in your lifetime, you can go from penniless to admiralty and at a fairly young age, right? And this spawns all kinds of having families later in life and all kinds of other weird effects that still reverberate in the United States today that it would take hours to point out all the places. But that's why it's different. It's different because the US is different. It's different because the way hierarchy operates is not strictly by birth. It's mostly by merit in the United States. And that's why when we talk about merit, that's an American project. Merit is almost entirely an American project in the way we conceive of it now.
I
there's
do
just
have
one
to
thing I
add
want to point
something
out.
to it, because like you have the pioneer stage, right, where something gets developed, right, and then you have an established industry, right, and so there's also not a transgression, a progression, right, where first you have to figure out like how do I even cut the whale, and then when you have an established order, like now you can just teach people, like you just put the knife here and you do this and you do that, and you don't have to have been educated effectively in order to do the butchering, right? So, and it's the same with the ships, right? Like if you have an industry that makes ships and like it's all rolling, right? Like it's different than there's one or two ships in town, right? Like that's just a completely different situation.
I also think this whole complementary but distinct spheres of governance thing is really, really hard to maintain. And I'm going to give you a Catholic example. This is kind of a hot issue still. There was this great push, especially from the French, for the monarchical papacy above all others, right? Almost as like a counterbalance to the French secular state there. This all kind of came to a head at the First Vatican Council, which was unfortunately interrupted by a war, and so we only got the document on Revelation and the document on the papacy, and they didn't go through the whole church like they were planning on and give a theological and disciplinary doctrine on, okay, what are bishops supposed to be like? What are priests supposed to be like? The religious, that project was only completed in Vatican II. So because we had this lopsided council, your canon law especially, and the way the church was governed, it started to become a little bit lopsided. It all became Rome-centric. And especially, the 1917 Code of Canon Law was a magnificent work. It was a great work. It put a lot of order where there had been chaos previously, but it was reflective of its time. And when you read that, you get the sense that the bishops were just like middle managers in Catholic Incorporated, that they didn't have any real decision-making power on their own, which is something that the Second Vatican Council has been trying to revive, is this sense of proper subsidiarity and real decision-making on every level. Within certain boundaries, of course. Anyway, the point is that the Dutch system seems to have that, where you've got the separation of powers there, but that seems really difficult to maintain, and we always tend to want to centralize things too much. And I think especially in this era, greater and greater centralization enabled by technology, especially the printing press and telegraphs have that tendency to more and more concentrate things into one person. So that's what I was really thinking about when I was reading this. And I wonder if Melville wasn't thinking about it too, because all of a sudden we're given a reflections on Ahab, right? And Ahab seems to be using a lot of the trappings and traditions of the naval class. You know, it talks about here. I've got the paragraph right here. Let's
Well, one sec, Father. I looked it up. It seems that when Moby Dick was published in 1851, the Pope was Pope Pius the Ninth.
correct.
And just maybe you could say a word or two about the significance of what was going on then.
Oh yeah, he had the Papal States taken away from him, and he was a prisoner in the Vatican.
And then some of the dogma it says here about the Immaculate Conception.
Yeah.
And First Vatican Council
Mm-hmm.
doctrine of papal infallibility was defined.
Sure. Yeah. I honestly, I know infallibility sounds like really, special, but it doesn't get used that terribly often. Universal jurisdiction, that's where the real money is.
Interesting.
A universal, immediate, ordinary, and supreme jurisdiction over the entire church.
So not anything quiet going on with the whole Catholic thing during the publication of Moby Dick. I think that was pretty interesting since we've been kind of looking at the world at large.
They would have only been a couple of years out of the unification of Italy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for interrupting you. You wanted to pull up a piece of text.
Yes. So I had to read this last two paragraphs like 4 times to start to understand it, because Melville was just really going at it. Nor perhaps will it fail to be eventually perceived that behind those forms of usages, the traditions of the Navy and the captaincy, these different levels of things, as it were, he sometimes masked himself, incidentally making use of them for other and more private ends than they were legitimately intended to subserve. That certain sultanism of his brain, which had otherwise in a good degree remained unmanifested, through those forms, that same sultanism became incarnate in an irresistible dictatorship, because there's no longer that other power on the ship that can counterbalance the captain anymore. And then he gets into this really strange thing. This it is, for that ever keeps God's true princes of the empire from the world's hustings, and leaves the highest honors of this era it could give to those men who became famous more through their infinite inferiority to the choice hidden handful of the divine inert than through their undoubted superiority over the dead level of that mass. So we're given like this 3-part image of like, there's these extremely brilliant people who aren't able to do anything for some reason. And then you've got the inner, or the dead level of the mass. That's most people. And then you've got like this middle level where they've got something a little more earthly about them, a little more earthly potency. And they're able to be the ones who actually rule on the earth. So such large virtue lurks in these small things when extreme political superstitions invest them, that in some royal instances, even to idiot imbecility, they have imparted potency. Then the plebeian herds crouch abased before the tremendous centralization. I mean, I think I got some of this paragraph, but it's a real whopper.
I did look this one up earlier in the week. The whole thing of like the choice hidden handful of the divine inert is apparently that's like a Gnostic idea that was put forth about people being chosen by God for extra knowledge and holiness specifically. So you've got like kind of these sort of anointed ones that he has here, and he's kind of like making the parallel there to sultanism.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that really interesting, where he's kind of describing like just before the paragraph that you began, where he says that he's Captain Ahab is very aware of the various naval usages and everything, and he he allows a lot of things. So he allows people to, like, cross over places where normally you would take your shoes off, but he just kind of lets people kind of do that. And he also often goes, and I like that he says he will address people in unusual terms, whether in condescension or in terrorem, is pretty great. But I like that it also kind of points out that even though he's aware of how to run a ship, he's also seemingly doing some shady stuff. Like, I don't know how many shady things you can do out at sea, just like secluded on a boat. But the apparently he's getting up to some stuff, and we had kind of seen in a previous chapter that sometimes he goes back to like the storage hold at like 3 o'clock in the morning or something like that, and no one has any idea what he's doing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if you're the captain of a ship, the worst business you can get up into is to use the ship other than what the ship stakeholders have sent you out to do with that ship and crew.
Yeah, and I also I haven't read the book, haven't finished it, but I get this sense of foreshadowing here. I don't know. What do you guys think?
So I want to connect it to what's happening now, right? And what we see with the centralization in modern times. And I think in some sense, centralization is the correct response to change, right? Like, especially things like war, right? You want to have a central authority to respond to the threat. Well, you can have a big disaster as well, right? You want to organize resources at the level that you can actually supply what and see what needs what, right? So that's correct. But in the centralization, and you see it in the Dutch system, right? We nationalize the police, right? Which is like in somewhat correct, right? Like, if you want to fight the drug cartels or whatever, like, you want to have a national response. Like, you don't want to have like 50 subsidiaries that don't have proper communication or whatever, right? Like, you want to have. But then there's other stuff, right? Like me actually going to the police from my church and complaining about basically that they're entering the private property without consent. And like, the only way that they were willing to respond is that something is in progress or I press charges. And the only person that gets to press charges is the owner of the property. Right? So like, they're completely disconnected from participation with me, because who am I? Well, like, and so the other thing that we see in modern times, right, is basically, well, you can see it in this EU chef character, that police chef character that wrote this letter to Elon Musk, basically interfering in the American elections, right? As well as by making a threat to Elon Musk, and like what's happening there, right? Like I heard it explained as well. There's political interest from the EU, right? And then there's this personal character, and like, he probably got the go ahead on some level, right? But he still made it on personal authority, right? And so there was an interference that happened, right, where the authority was not used for what the purpose of the authority is, right? Like, the authority was usurped in personal means, and you can see it in the police supporting the Muslims in the UK, for example, right? So there's a personal interpretation that a policeman can have within the expression of the law, and it ends up being biased towards certain ends, and like, that's, in some sense, it's inevitable, right? Because like, if you start clamping down, you're gonna clamp down from a position, right? You're gonna promote something, and that will always be in favor of your person, unless you're like extremely virtuous.
So just briefly going back to the specific paragraph that we were looking at. I do think it's worth mentioning that Melville specifically talks about Tsar Nicholas. And Tsar Nicholas I is known for being an autocrat. So it's interesting how he even phrases it. It says, "But when and then comma, as in the case of Nicholas the Tsar, comma, the ringed crown of geographical empire encircles the imperial brain, colon, then the plebeian herds crouch abased before the tremendous centralization. Nor will the tragic dramatist who would depict moral indomitableness in its fullest sweep and direct swing ever forget a hint, incidentally so important as in his art as the one now alluded to. And so I picked up on this a little bit because Castle raised the point about who the divine inert are, and it's very interesting because in this very brief passage, in this rather short chapter, all things considered, um, he's basically again called everybody out a little bit more directly as compared to some of his stuff with the whales that we were talking about. And to go back to Nicholas specifically as this symbol of autocracy, we're past the point where the French of King Louis in his court, I believe it's the 14th, 15th, and 16th, essentially centralized in France.
14th especially.
Right. And it's that centralization, the building of Versailles specifically, and bringing the court and the functions of the government together in one place outside the city, that Nicholas also in part achieves. And that's part of that centralization. It's not just one government that starts to do everything. I mean, it's literally in one place, or sorry, not literally, actually in one place. And it's very interesting. So he's now called out all these types and forms of how things should be organized. You've got the sort of Gnostic-y stuff. You've got the power for power's sake and through power and will kind of thing with Tsar Nicholas. And then he goes into, but Ahab, my captain, still moves before me in all his Nantucket grimminess and shagginess. And in this episode touching emperors and kings, I must not conceal that I have only to do with a poor old whale hunter like him. And therefore, all outward majestical trappings and housings are denied me. O Ahab, what shall be grand in thee, it must needs be plucked from the skies and dived for in the deep and featured in the unbodied air. So, this is where I again pick up on what Father Eric mentioned about priests being butchers as well, and driving into the heart of things to pull out their value, like the Speck Snyder does. And there's something that's just been very present to me, which is, if I'm remembering correct, it's the Hebrew letter Zion, which is itself seen as something that cuts to the heart of things. I'm not going to go too far into that. Father Eric's nodding a little bit, so I'm glad that landed. But there is that thing where Ahab, the captain, and this construct and this organization on the boat, as opposed to these other places that are pursuing the frontier, it's on the frontier itself that the captain is able to plumb the depths, pluck things from the sky, and only in doing that is it revealed what his grandness is. And then suddenly we're at the dinner table.
So
Yeah. I
make-
guess the big point I'm taking from this chapter is that Ahab doesn't have a Speck Snyder to push back on him.
yeah.
You don't have this independent authority with a different sphere of influence that can push against his tyranny. So,
And to make the connection to the dinner table, right? Like Louis XIV, right? He had all the people come to Versailles and stuff, right? And so a bunch of things happened, right? Like culture became a lot more important, right? Like they were all referencing, imitating the king, right? So instead of having the attention on the ruling of their territories, they were vying for status, right? So status as in representing yourself, not status as in having conquest, honor, achievements, but status as in ethereal status. Like it's not grounded.
It's self-referencing.
Yeah, it's self-reference, but yeah, it's not grounded in anything, right? Like it's the game for the game's sake. It's not the game for a material manifestation's sake. And well, when we get to the dinner table, right, we also see the game for the game's sake. Like there's actually a theatrical component that gets introduced.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know how Ishmael found out about any of this stuff in chapter 34. I suppose his friend Queequeg must have told him all about it, but we'll allow it as a storytelling device. We've got Doughboy the steward. I wonder what his real name is, but sometimes people get nicknames and they're unable to escape them. Doughboy is just terrorized by the different officers here. We get into a description about how Ahab goes down for supper first, and then Starbuck, and then Flask, and then Stub, and then they go out in reverse order, and it's like they're eating in dead quiet. And Melville points out this really interesting thing where the different mates might be arguing with each other while they're on deck and speaking quite freely with each other, because like when you're running a boat, and especially if something's going wrong, if you see something that somebody higher up the chain of command doesn't see, you got to let them know, and you might need to yell at them so that they understand, like, hey, the wind's changing, we need to, right? So that sort of thing. But then when they get below deck, when they don't have that unifying them anymore, they're just sitting there in like an icy silence, because Ahab is not behaving, and it's he makes this really interesting point that when you're hosting somebody, you really get to set the tone for how things are going to be, right? Like hosting is super. It's not something you can just do without any effort. It takes effort to be a really good host to somebody. And Ahab, the way he's hosting these guys in the captain's cabin is like extremely formal, and like he doesn't make them feel welcome at all. He seems to like to see them squealing, rather than trying to build up camaraderie among the officers on the ship, which I think a better leader might do. It's a tough balance, but like you can have a certain amount of camaraderie and also a certain amount of authority if you're doing your job properly.
Was it Ahab kind of sneaking around at night, or am I misremembering?
Ahab's barely sleeping at this point. He might lay in his bunk for 3 hours, and he spends a lot of time in the inner room in his cabin.
Right, and he's a very habitual guy, because it pointed out earlier that there are, or maybe I read too far ahead, but there are marks in the very ship itself from where he trods, which is interesting because anybody who's familiar with wood in their houses is like, it does over time wear down, but it doesn't point that out about anybody else. It's specifically Ahab is so habitual. So I would imagine that his troubled sleep in some of this adds to kind of his demeanor, and he may not have the bandwidth, or he may not have the priority about what's going on about certain points of the table. Like he hasn't set down like, no, even the squires should behave. He does not set down that rule.
Mm-hmm. There's a little humorous bit about Stub being the third mate. He's always the last one in, and he's always the first one out.
Is he butterless?
He's butterless. He doesn't dare take the butter, and Ahab doesn't offer it to him. So, and he used to just eat whatever everybody else ate before he became the third mate, and he was full then. But now, because sometimes his meals are very short, he barely gets to eat at all before he knows. And all of this is just implicit, right? He knows that he has to leave, because obviously the second mate can't come out of the cabin before the third mate. That's incorrect. And nobody wants to stay there any longer than they absolutely have to. So he was better off on the top of the bottom than being on the bottom of the top. But then when you get the harpooneers, they just have a jolly old time, because they're all three basically equal with each other, and they love tormenting Doughboy with his pale loaf of bread face.
Yeah, I have to imagine that Doughboy is not fat.
He is skinny. I think he has a round face, but he's skinny. I think it says at some point.
Yeah, so you know, in some ways, these 3 chapters are doing the same thing at 3 different scales, right? They're just setting up the hierarchical relationships of different things in different ways, but they're showing it at 3 different scales, and this is the personal scale, obviously, the scale of this ship, right? So you've got the scale of what they're hunting, you've got the scale of like how whaling ships, or you know, the whole history to some extent, right? Such as it is, and then you've got the scale of this ship, and that is partially done, I think, to give you a sense for the awkwardness, the strangeness of what is happening aboard this particular ship on this particular voyage at this particular point in time, without making an authoritative statement, right? Because he's using the contrast of, well, here's how whales are designed, here's how whaling ships are supposed to work, and here's why the hierarchy works that way. And everybody already knows hospitality. You kind of have to take that for granted, especially now because we don't have politeness and hospitality anymore. To your earlier point, Father Eric, the host is supposed to set the mood, the tone, and enable everybody to interact in a certain way. You're supposed to offer the butter to everybody if they're not taking it, right? And then if they refuse, that's fine, but you're not supposed to let them go without it, you know, for want of permission or something, or for want of awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And so this would have highlighted for a reader of the time how strange the ship was. Like we can't do that for us in the same way. But like, man, this is weird. The way they're eating is weird.
It's like a bunch of teenagers on their phones the entire time.
Only worse.
Yeah.
So I have a question, and this is conjecture from anyone's part, but if Stubb was offered the butter, would he take it?
I think he would. I 100% think he would. And
He'd
I
have
think
to.
I think it basically says that if Ahab had struck up a conversation or had asked any questions,
Yep.
the whole mood of the table would have changed.
Yep.
Because he's allowing dialogue now, but he just sits there and eats in silence. And so it's like, well, this is the host, and I guess we're eating like monks. Would somebody just stand up and do a reading so this isn't weird anymore? Because that's how the monks would actually do it.
Right. Well, and also, RJ, I know we've talked about this recently, in fact, right? Like, you should not refuse a host by default. You should only refuse a host with a reason. Like, you should always allow somebody to offer you something, and you should accept it, right? Like, that's actually
even if
really
you're just going to
important.
try a little bit of it.
That's actually also in the Bible, by the way. That's
Different
Paul
book.
saying you should accept the sacrificial meat, right? Like,
Of course, the very first host we see in the Bible is Abraham. But you know, it's just hard not to think about that for the moment where perhaps someone who is failing to be a proper host is not able to invite the spirit from above, so to speak. And what I really mean in saying that is, if you are not considering the things that should be considered as host, it is very difficult to maintain a room in which conversation flows, people are comfortable, and which is all a long way of saying grace with extra steps.
I wanted to add just a few things, if I could. To the point about him not kind of properly hosting, you know, he's thrown away his pipes, so he's no longer sending breath upwards. He's not doing any sort of mediation or anything like that. He's keeping people down, speaking to them in condescending and in terrorum ways. And I also wanted to point out just kind of like this microcosm, macrocosm thing that we are seeing. Ishmael is in the same way that he did in the Cetology chapter. He's laying out the threes over and over again, all in descending order. And I took a look. It's Flask. It's the smallest guy that is the one that's not. He's butterless and not eating enough.
Oh, sorry, I got them mixed up. My bad.
But it makes sense because Stubb sounds like he's the shortest guy. But I'm thinking of this thing with like kind of the folio, the octavo, and the duodecimo thing. That you have Ahab as the folio, and then you have the 3 mates as kind of the octavos. So they're the same shape but smaller, you know. And then you have the duodecimos, who are kind of like the porpoises, who are not hunted. They're not under the same sort of. They're not being looked at in the same way. So you have Queequeg and I forgot the other two guys' names, but they're
Hashtego and Dagu.
Yes, and so they're there just eating loudly and like just boisterously, like it within earshot of these other guys who are terrified of making any noise at all, and they're just munching down and terrorizing poor Doughboy and everybody, and they're just having a fun time. And I just kind of compared that a little bit with Ishmael's descriptions of some of the porpoise.
You guys want to hear something absolutely very weird just about the world and life? Apparently, the Dewey Decimal System was created by a Melville Dewey in 1876, which was about 20 years after this was published. So they're
Yes.
it's no relation, but there's something about Melvilles and the organization of stuff that's going on in this couple of decades. Just a weird little thing about the world.
So
Indeed.
I actually see it differently. Like I think it's completely different. Like because there's in my reading there's two tables, right, which is twice the same table, right? So first of all, the table is in the captain's cabin, right, which is like the holy of holies, right? And then the first table is led by the captain as an authority, right? So he's representing the earthly hierarchy thing, right? And then the second table, which is the people who are supposed to do the harpooning, right, which is the role of the spec Snyder, right? They don't have a head, and they're in disarray, right? So the thing that should compensate the tyranny doesn't have a manifestation. It doesn't have a body.
I love that point because it reminds me of now I'm kind of seeing that as they are kind of like reverse hierarchies because then you do have a fourth and that's Doughboy. And with the point of them not having a head, they literally, at one point when he wasn't serving them correctly, grabbed him, and the Native American guy motioned as if he was scalping him. And so you are kind of seeing that upside down hierarchy. I like that.
Yeah. That's that. Yeah. Oh yeah. Like and the cook is the spec Snyder. Obviously, that's the funny part. Yeah. Like
Well,
literally, and it's even more so because like the meat was quarried, like it wasn't cut, it was quarried out of.
Dug into, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to point out too. So at the end of the last chapter, and it's good that we read that, right? He entreats Ahab to go up, grab the good stuff, right? Go down, grab the stuff,
yeah.
and bring it manifested in the middle, effectively.
Featured
right?
in the unbodied air.
Right. That's the manifestation, which harkens back to the Language Creation Book Club on navigating patterns, because I think he talks about that better there in some ways. But like that is what leads into this chapter, right? So in other words, in the previous chapter, he's saying this is how it's supposed to be. And then he's pointing out that it isn't that way, right, at all. And then another sort of interesting part is that he says the Pequod might be more properly be said to have lived more out of the cabin than in it. So again, there's this, maybe it's not quite an inversion of hierarchy, but there's this disruption of what is supposed to be, how things are supposed to operate. And because of that disruption, there is a pall, a silence upon the ship, in general. And that's not a healthy thing. And, again, I think probably foreshadowing there, but all three of these chapters are, to me, just very telling about what's to come.
It's almost, so if we're going to go back to the ship as a microcosm of society, then the captain's cabin is supposed to be, to Manuel's point, a holy of holies, a place where, the head of the ship is at its purest. And it's almost like the priests of the ship are not attending the tabernacle properly,
Right.
are not in communion with one another, and well, it's going to be headless then, and a headless ship is not.
So I was saving this, and I do want to hear Manuel's point, but just because it's directly relevant now. Back in the first time I read this at my Jesuit university in college, there was points that parallels between this table and the Eucharist table. Is that something that anybody had thoughts on, or Father, you specifically?
Yeah, only insofar as any dinner table is
Hmm.
like the Last Supper, the Eucharist. Obviously, what I do on a Sunday morning is higher and grander, but that doesn't mean that the lower tables, without the full sacrifice, are not worthy. So yeah, I mean, Ahab's supposed to be a good host, and he's not, and that's going to cause problems down the line.
A couple of things stuck out to me as well to these points. So I was thinking about at the very beginning of the chapter, Ishmael brings up that there's a smooth medallion-shaped tablet reserved for keeping track, like a sundial, that is on the upper part of Ahab's leg. So he's keeping track of the light also on his leg, so like on the white pillar that he walks on. And then I'm just kind of seeing this thing of, there's no, usually in, the holy place, as Ishmael kind of talks about it with the captain's cabin, you would expect there to be light, of some kind, but it's unintelligible what you're supposed to be doing at the table. You're not receiving any light or hosting from the captain. And even to the point where the golden oily substance, the oil or the butter, is a thing that's kind of like off limits even to the priestly guys. So I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, so association, butter, anointing. He's not getting anointed.
Yeah.
And that's described here. They're the fruits of promotion now. There's the vanity of glory. There's the insanity of life. Besides, if it were so that a mere sailor of Picard had a grudge, he would only have to look through the cabin skylight. So there's a sense that the promised thing, right, of a high society or whatever, the elite, is not manifesting in the lower class of the elite, and that they're suffering more so than the lower class itself. And I also think it's important to see that, at least as far as I understood, that the order is not imposed. The order emerges. So there's and we went into that in the previous chapter as well, right? Like there's this social order that's being abused, right? But like it's not an abuse that is intended, or like it's just something that manifests because people assume roles, right? Or assume what they assume of roles, right? Like that's with the butter, right? Like, okay, I don't get to have butter because whatever reason is in my head, and that's not part of the actual order on the ship, but it is established order. And so you see the two realities in conflict, right? And well, like this is a different issue with legalism, right? So like one sense of you over legislate, right, where you just like you have too many laws and you can't relate to the laws anymore. But like there's also a sense where there's extra laws, right, implied laws that aren't enforced or actually spoken, but they are manifest.
It'd be very different if Ahab was like, now listen up, Flask. Starbucks getting kind of anemic. He needs more energy when he's out on deck. And we don't have enough butter for all four of us for this because I want him to have extra butter. I'm going to need you to just not have butter for this voyage, right? It'd be an utterly different way of getting to the same place. And it would look very different because it's like, you're getting a direction from above, even though it comes to the same conclusions there. But yeah, it comes out of the silence, and something's going to fill the silence, and it might not even be correct.
I do like too it with kind of like the implied laws type of thing that it does say here that that Flask Since had Flask helped himself, the chances were Ahab had never so much as noticed it. So there's kind of like, he is, to the previous point that was made about, Ahab's just kind of probably enjoying people squirm, or just letting them try to assume their roles, or like try to figure things out without actually informing them.
Or his mind is somewhere else entirely.
Entirely.
He's
More
utterly obsessed with something else, doesn't even notice that these people are here.
The implication that I got was that Ahab very much expects people to behave appropriately and correctly for their station, and he's not even aware that that isn't going on. And the reason why I think that's clear is because that dichotomy between, we'll call it attention, and we'll say proper order, is all over this book so far. That's been made in previous chapters, where and it's been explicit in the past, where he's, I mean, in one sense. So one way to look at this is to say that our lovely narrator, his only, his biggest problem is he has too much attention. He's paying too much attention to everything, right? And you can say, well, how do you back that up? Well, it's he and the crazy guy who see the 5 guys or whatever go on board. What's that? And then he looks for them and doesn't find them, right? And Queequeg's completely like, oh, what are you talking about, dude? Right? And so you get this sense that this tale, from the narrator's point of view, as unreliable as he may or may not be, is very much the difference between, we'll say, right attention and right order. And what happens when you assume one and you don't have both. And that's the contrast, is between right order and right attention. And I think the way to look at this, because I have a sense for how this ends. I don't know why. But one way to look at this is to say, when your attention overwhelms your order, you no longer have right attention. Okay? And then what happens is, the order can last for a long time without being attended to, but it won't hold forever that way, right? And this is sort of the problem, just to link it to today. Like, that's the problem we're having. A lot of people don't realize a lot of things can run on autopilot a lot longer than you think, because people mimic and they follow patterns, right? And so they don't fall apart when you think they should. But what happens is you forget, oh, this piece that is missing now, this thing, went away. And that means the wheels are off the bus, and the bus doesn't crash right away. So you forget, oh, the bus didn't crash, so maybe I was wrong, right? It's like, no, that was the important part. And then the bus crashes later, and you look for something more proximal. And it's like, no, the bus was already crashed. And so that's why the foreshadowing in this book is important, right? Because he's showing you, no, we left port, we were screwed. Whatever happens after this point is kind of irrelevant. Like, there could be no white whale, right? The captain's mind is in a bad place. He's not keeping order correctly. Not because he's not ordered. He is. Obviously, he's a successful captain. He has to be ordered. But because his attention is so consumed by something else inappropriately. Hey, we just left port. Hey, man, keep a lookout for white whales. Okay, let me explain something very carefully here. There ain't no whales anywhere near Nantucket by this point in time. All the whales are dead. Like, they're not that close to Nantucket. There's a reason why they're going into the Pacific Ocean to get whales. And that reason is there ain't no whales left in the Atlantic, right? So the odds of seeing a whale in the Atlantic at this point are like already very low. And the odds of seeing a white one are pretty much like non-existent. And so early on, you get the sense that he's so obsessed with something that is completely inappropriate, that if he thought about it for 4 seconds, he would be like, you wouldn't say that. Like, why would you say that? Look out for a white whale? Like, what What are you talking about, dude? There's no whales in the Atlantic. We've pretty much dispensed with all of them.
I think this exact point that you're making is actually exemplified really well in just the first paragraph of this. Actually, so he's there, and Doughboy comes to announce that dinner it's time for dinner, and Ahab is looking at this medallion-shaped tablet that is presumably like under a folded-up pant leg or something like that he hides on his leg, and so he's watching that, and he doesn't even acknowledge Doughboy like at all. That he goes, and that it seems like he didn't even hear him, and then he just stands up and says, "Dinner, Mr. Starbuck," and goes. So there's also that kind of disconnect between the chef or the Speck Snyder and him, and now you just completely ignored and like on the bottom there, and then just like pass right over for as you said, just kind of like assuming order. Like, okay, the guy told me the thing, and that's all his usefulness. So I'll just let him go back and do that, and I don't even need to talk to him.
So a couple things added there, right? So like what do you call that? That's someone with their head in the clouds, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the head that's floating above the body, in a profound sense. Like what happened with the ship, right? Like Ahab wasn't there, right? But his crew got switched out, right? So the body got switched out, and he hasn't accounted for the fact that his body got changed, and like he didn't even come out like for the first while, right? And you see that, like it's the same thing with the technocracy that we're having, right? Like we're devising systems and we're not accounting for the participation in that, and so we're ruling, not accounting for the competence of the people that are being ruled. And yeah, like then that disconnection, right? Because like I think this is what the focus on too much perfection is, right? And like Iron Mark actually deal with this problem, right? Because like we see these patterns, right? And now it's like, how do you communicate these patterns back to people in a way that they can use them to actually improve their lives? And that seems almost impossible. like, and it's even worse that like you say something and people say yes, right? And they mean yes. So it's not that they try to deceive you. No, they actually mean yes, right? And then 2 sentences later or 2 actions later, you just know that they didn't get it. And in their mind, they did get it, right? So in some sense, that's also not the body unable to reach up to the head, and that issue, like that's really important, right? And you see the 2 aspects, right? Like, so you see the people in authority know how to relate to authority, and the people without authority behead the authority. They make a mess of everything, right? And it happens in the same place, right? Like that's also important, right? So like there's a, yeah, like, and we have a saying, if the cat's away from home, the mice dance on the table. It's like when the head is removed.
That's really close to a saying in English.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's probably the same saying.
Is it?
Ours
Okay.
is better.
When the cat's away, the mice will play.
Okay.
I'm
We win.
sure it sounds good in Dutch.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think people like that one so much. Tom and Jerry seems to be that to a T.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, it's playing with that relationship constantly.
I wanted to just mention a couple of fun lines in here. Really, all I have left for this chapter is I did find it really comical. Just the part where he describes Doughboy's whole life was one continual lip quiver. Was a great line where he's just being terrorized by the harpooneers. And then also with respect to Daegu, being a gigantic guy, but also he eats almost daintily compared to the other guys, and like eats very little for his stature. And that he says here that not by beef or by bread are giants made or nourished. So I thought that was a great line.
And there are more great lines lined up for us next week. So another excellent discussion, gentlemen. I appreciate your participation, and I'll post next week's reading assignment on the Discord server. If you happen to be listening and you want a part of this, you can click at the Discord server, which is underneath us. That link should be good for a week. And otherwise, you guys take care. God bless you all. And if you see a white whale, split your lungs for him.